Hello, I'm Dr. Daniel Lebowitz. I'm a medical doctor. I practice as a radiologist and an anti-aging physician in the Philadelphia suburbs. I'm an activist on behalf of targeted individuals. Over the past 2 years, I've worked with the leadership of Freedom from Covert Harassment and Surveillance, or FFCHS. I have worked with the medical committee as well as with the board of directors. As a result, I've communicated with hundreds of targeted individuals. Additionally, I have worked with 2 other activist physicians on behalf of targeted individuals, Dr. John Hall and Dr. Terry Robertson. I've also worked with Dr. Robert Duncan, a scientist turned whistleblower, who states that he's worked on some of the very weapon systems that are used in the electronic harassment that many targeted individuals experience. My presentation today is entitled Targeted Individuals, Covert Repression in the 21st Century. To understand the targeted individual phenomenon, you need to understand several things about it. You need to understand what societal trends allow it to occur. You need to understand what the program is. You need to understand what the goals and purpose of the program are. You need to understand who it happens to. You need to understand where the program came from. And you need to understand the implications of the program and what it means for the future. Finally, we'll take a look at what can be done about it. So here's what's going on right now in the United States. In short, we're seeing the emergence of a police and surveillance state. Examples. The president has a kill list. About once a week he sits down and decides who he's going to kill that week, and these executions are carried out with no due process. Under NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, the president can have you kidnapped and detained indefinitely with no charges and no trial, even on American soil. Everyone's a suspect. For example, under NYPD stop and frisk law, you can be stopped and subjected to invasive and humiliating searches and pat-downs, even with no suspicion of a crime. State-sponsored violence against the population is expanding out of control. For example, in Minnesota, a SWAT team raided the wrong house in the middle of the night, handcuffed 3 young children, held the mother on the floor at gunpoint, shot the family dog, and then forced the handcuffed children to sit next to the dead and bloody pet for more than an hour while they searched the home. Equally outrageous was a 4-hour SWAT team raid in California high school, where students were locked down in classrooms and forced to urinate in overturned desks, and generally terrorized by heavily armed SWAT guards searching for possible weapons that were not found. In at least 2 U.S. cities, SWAT teams have been used to break up simple card games. Torture has been condoned at the highest levels. No one has been held accountable. Total surveillance is in effect and is being used for nefarious purposes. Every single form of communications are collected and stored and can be used to blackmail you, discredit you, or paint you as a wrongdoer at any point in the future. And this concern that the government could come after you in unsavory ways is not just theoretical. A story in The Intercept entitled How Covert Agents Infiltrate the Internet to Manipulate, Deceive, and Destroy Reputations reveals previously secret documents proving that government agents come after targets who have not been charged with or convicted of any crime, using such techniques as texting and emailing friends, colleagues, neighbors, and families with derogatory information, which in many cases may be false. Furthermore, they stop business deals and ruin business relationships. So the state is ruining the lives of innocents. This is happening with no oversight and no public knowledge. Department of Homeland Security runs a campaign entitled, If You See Something, Say Something. It encourages people to scrutinize those around them and report anything suspicious to law enforcement. So again, everyone's a potential suspect, and regular people are being used as the eyes and ears of the state. Also revealed by The Intercept, the U.S. has a rapidly expanding secret national database of over 1 million potential terrorists, over half of whom actually have no known ties to terrorism. People can be put on the list with no proof of wrongdoing, and in fact no concrete facts at all. This information is shared between federal and local law enforcement, government agencies, foreign governments, and private entities. This can lead to firing, blacklisting, difficulty traveling, or police harassment. So with all of these disturbing trends, the targeted individual phenomenon becomes a lot less difficult to believe. Looking at surveillance alone, that which has now been proved would have been considered conspiracy theory just a couple of years ago. So what are targets complaining of? Constant surveillance, secret campaigns to destroy their lives, rights being violated, being treated as criminals or terrorists, even though never charged with a crime and no opportunity to clear their name, torture, scrutiny and surveillance often carried out by regular people, secret databases and secret notifications. Absolutely. These trends can now be shown in the general society at large, as I have just demonstrated. Next, what is the targeted individual program? It is many things all at once. It is a discrediting and disruption program, similar to COINTELPRO. It is a torture, interrogation, brainwashing, and mind control program, like MKUltra. It is a secret form of repression, persecution, and psychological warfare, carried out in the community largely by regular people, along the lines of Stasi or Zersetzen torture. It is a political abuse of psychiatry, as has been carried out in many countries as a way to torture and discredit dissidents. Finally, it is unethical, non-consensual human experimentation on unwitting subjects with advanced directed energy and psychotronic weapon systems. Overall, it represents a coming together of the most vicious and effective tools and weapons for covert harassment and political control of dissidents, activists, whistleblowers, agitators, those aware of corruption, and other, quote, undesirables, unquote, that the world has ever seen. What are the goals and purposes of the program? Again, many. Let's start with an understanding of the mentality of the state. President Obama's information czar, former Harvard law professor Cass Sunstein, co-authored a paper in 2008 which advocated that the government should, quote, cognitively infiltrate and disable, unquote, those who have ideas which the government finds threatening. For example, 9/11 truth activists. Now, at a minimum, this suggests running illegal COINTELPRO type disruption campaigns. But more interestingly, let's parse the words carefully. Cognitively infiltrate and disable. Cognition refers to the mind or to thought. Infiltrate means to penetrate with hostile intent. So literally, these words mean to penetrate the minds or thought processes of troublesome individuals with the intent of disabling those individuals. Fascinating in light of what targeted individuals experience. More specifically, what are the goals of the program? Force the target to stop unacceptable activities such as whistleblowing, activism, exposing corruption, etc. Silence the target, both about original activism and about their targeting. Subject the target to noise campaigns, swarming, colors, and repetitive behaviors as a form of harassment. Attack any psychological weaknesses. Cause the target to blame themselves for their targeting, and as such destroy their will to fight back. Create a track record of so-called mental illness, useful for discrediting and plausible deniability. Discredit the target. Isolate the target from all forms of support using secret notifications, slander, and covert harassment, carried out largely by regular people. Encourage the target to lose hope and lash out in suicidal or homicidal rage, secondary to covert harassment and destruction of the target's life. Set the target up for possible institutionalization or arrest. Damage or ruin the career and or finances. In some cases, break up the target's family. Potentially cause the target to become homeless. After breaking the target's will to fight, in some cases, attempt to change the mindset, politics, or ethics of the target. Create a mindset more useful for the state, Evaluate the potential for corruption or even recruitment. To summarize, the goal is the neutralization of the target, which is exactly the goal pursued by the former COINTELPRO program. Okay, so who gets targeted by this program? There's a lot of overlap with COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO targeted, quote, perceived threats to the established political and social order, unquote, which in practice during COINTELPRO meant civil rights activists, peace activists, women's rights activists, dissidents, so-called unfriendly politicians, or even just nonconformists and individual activists. In some cases, it can be proven that counterintelligence operations have been undertaken against those aware of high-level criminality or wrongdoing. Let's learn from some actual examples of people who became targets for covert operations. Thomas Drake, an NSA whistleblower, forced out of his job, blacklisted, financially ruined, forced to defend himself against criminal charges, and placed under physical and electronic surveillance. Jean Seberg was a COINTELPRO victim. She was an actress and a civil rights activist, and she supported the Black Panther Party. She experienced FBI surveillance, harassment, stalking, break-ins, intimidation, defamation, and discrediting. She was victim of a false FBI news story that she was pregnant by a Black Panther Party member while she was at the time married to a white husband. The stress of this caused her to prematurely deliver her baby, which subsequently died at 2 days of age. The baby was white, by the way, and she eventually committed suicide. Arnold Lokshin is a cancer researcher, and he was a supporter of socialism. He experienced surveillance, harassment, and threats by strangers, break-ins, psychological warfare, implied death threats throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Eventually, he sought asylum from Russia, and when he did so, he was immediately fired, blacklisted, accused in retrospect of mental instability and deteriorating work performance. Notably, he reported that even his children's classmates and his own father had been brought into a Stasi-like campaign against him and his family. He eventually wrote a book about the ordeal in 1988 called Silent Terror, One Family's History of Political Persecution in the U.S. The book was never published or distributed in the U.S. On the web, you can find him at arnoldlokshin.wordpress.com. By the way, his work performance and mental stability in Russia have apparently been just fine. You have Adrian Schoolcraft. He blew the whistle on corruption and wrongful arrests, arrest quotas, and the stop and frisk program within the New York Police Department in 2009. He received on-the-job harassment and was shunted toward the NYPD psychologist. Within 3 weeks after reporting corruption, he was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward, handcuffed to a bed, and prevented from using a telephone. He was portrayed as paranoid during his hospital stay, which lasted 6 days. After discharge, he was suspended from the police force without pay, and ultimately, tapes that he had made, which were reported by the New York Times and others, and he has been largely vindicated subsequently. Dr. Lawrence Dorr is an orthopedic surgeon, and as reported by the New York Times, he wrote an open letter to fellow surgeons in 2008 warning about a flawed hip prosthesis. He subsequently became the target of a whisper campaign that questioned his skills and competence as a surgeon. A gentleman by the name of Russell Roderick apparently insulted a powerful and politically connected firm by refusing continued employment. It's unclear if he was aware of any high-level wrongdoing. He has been the target of a 25-year multinational campaign, and you will find that this stuff is multinational. It follows targets wherever they go, including slander, character assassination, allegations of incompetence, paranoia, drug addiction, sexual deviance, and being a, quote, deranged suicidal maniac, unquote. He's experienced blacklisting, financial devastation, isolation, stalking, overt surveillance, street theater, telephone, computer, and mail tampering, Stasi-like manipulation of people into a campaign against him, death threats, intimidation, harassment, and a shutdown of all avenues of support. He refers to this as Zersetson torture. On the web, you can find his writings at zersetson.wikispaces.com. Next, you have the Grenham Women's Peace protesters. In the 1980s, they were protesting the presence of U.S. cruise missiles at an English Air Force base. They came under microwave weapons attack in 1984. Scientists from Electronics Today demonstrated the presence of electromagnetic waves, and Dr. Robert Becker, who was twice nominated for the Nobel Prize, found their symptoms were consistent with exposure to a microwave weapon. And every time a cruise missile convoy is ready to drive by, these women were experiencing severe headaches and unbearable fatigue and what have you. You have Andy Lewis and his friends. They're a group of former British soldiers who became targets of full-on gang stalking in 1996 after attempts to draw attention to what they viewed as an unethical experimental vaccine program that had been given to Gulf War soldiers in 1991. These men have experienced blacklisting, covert harassment, directed energy and psychotronic weapons attacks, overt and covert harassment, secret notifications, etc. They've created two excellent websites, targeted-individuals.com and gang-stalking.com. A long list of 9/11 truth activists have reported being targeted with electromagnetic weapons and death threats. Some have died under suspicious circumstances. U.S. Army Major Doug Rockey, who has a Ph.D. in physics from University of Illinois and was former head of the U.S. Army Depleted Uranium Cleanup Project after Gulf War I, says that these weapons are very real and commonly used in military circles. He has described how he personally used such weapons on a regular basis while training with Army Special Forces. Quote, "We had them van-mounted, truck-mounted, plane-mounted, and hand-carried," he says. "We would go around zapping each other for fun. This was during exercises or sometimes just as a practical joke," unquote. He further stated that based on his first-hand knowledge of U.S. military mindset and capabilities, 9/11 truth activists have undoubtedly been targeted by exotic, non-lethal, and lethal weapons. Remember again Cass Sunstein, who openly advocated cognitive infiltration and disabling of 9/11 truth activists. Is he potentially talking about psychotronic weapons attacks? Professional surfer, model, and entrepreneur Jill Hansen received wide acclaim for her performance in a TED speech in 2010 about her spiritual values and altruistic beliefs, entitled Open Mind, Open Heart. In the talk, she espouses values including compassion, honesty, integrity, generosity, belief in God, charity, hope, faith, and love. She concludes by stating that the world would be a better place if we all felt this way. Within weeks after the wide-ranging publicity of this talk, she found herself the victim of stalking and electronic harassment. Fast forward a few years, and unfortunately, in May 2014, she was charged with attempted homicide for allegedly running over a woman intentionally with her car. TIs report that attempting to get them to act out inappropriately with strangers is a common aspect of the program. A couple interesting facts about her case. 1. None of the news stories mention that she considered herself a TI. And 2. Interestingly, the local neighborhood watch group's 500 members were on alert about Hansen, supposedly for reckless driving. A representative of the group was reported anonymously as saying, quote, "We need everybody to be on the lookout for her. It's that scary," unquote. So here we have someone who's reporting being a targeted individual and a victim of stalking, and it turns out that, hello, there were a group of at least 500 people who were deliberately on the lookout for her. Okay, so Ted Gunderson, he was a pretty big shot at the FBI. He worked for the FBI from 1950 to 1979. He was former head of the Los Angeles FBI, where he was in charge of 700 personnel and had a budget of $22 million. He was a handful of people in line for FBI director in 1979, which ultimately went to William H. Webster. He subsequently retired and started a private investigation firm. He became a whistleblower and compiled an affidavit in support of an attorney and targeted individual Keith Labella, who submitted a Freedom of Information Act request from the FBI regarding gang stalking. Gunderson explained, quote, "It is my professional opinion, based on information, knowledge, and belief, that the information sought by Mr. Labella in this FOIA suit regarding gang stalking reasonably describes an ongoing, active, covert, nationwide program that is in effect today and has been in effect since at least the 1980s, and has increased in scope, intensity, and sophistication by adapting to new communications and surveillance technology." Unquote. As a whistleblower, Gunderson was himself targeted. He experienced whisper campaigns, surveillance, phone tapping, computer hacking, poisonings, group stalking, aerial stalking, and more. He stated that based on his experience, victims are targeted for a variety of reasons, including government and corporate whistleblowers, parties to financial and employment disputes, parties to marital disputes, especially divorced women, and even jilted paramours, journalists covering controversial issues, and even attorneys and private investigators representing unpopular clients or interests. Gunderson's affidavit can be viewed on the internet and, in my opinion, is a fascinating read. William Binney, well known at this conference, is an NSA whistleblower and has stated in the past that he's aware of mind control technologies. There's been a steady increase of mass shootings in the U.S. ever since about 2000, at which time there were about 5 a year, and now it's up to about 16 a year. Let's talk about two mass shooters. Many of the mass shooters complain of electronic harassment symptoms. You had Jiverly Wong. He was an Asian immigrant and reported being targeted with covert harassment for 18 years, including stalking, harassment, chemical attacks, nausea, shortness of breath, job harassment and job loss, spreading of rumors, phantom touching at night while he was sleeping, home entry and theft of funds from his home, vehicular stalking and harassment leading to car accidents, and electronic body shocks. He became a mass shooter of 14 people, including himself, and of course blamed his harassers for the killings. Aaron Alexis is probably the most famous TI shooter. He was a Navy veteran, and he became the Navy Yard shooter. He contacted FFCHS, stating that he was under electromagnetic weapons attack and believed that this was at the hands of the Navy. Interesting things about his case. Number one, although he corresponded with FFCHS, identifying himself as a TI and stating his belief that the Navy was attacking him, after a complete investigation, the FBI concluded that, including interviews with FFCHS board members, insisted that he was a random shooter with no motive. Number two, there was a heavily armed SWAT team in the vicinity of the Navy Yard near the start of his shooting rampage, and they were on the site within 5 minutes. Inexplicably, they were ordered to stand down and leave the area. The shooting rampage continued on for another 45 minutes. Okay, so we know who it happens to. We know this is the most sophisticated takedown program the world has ever seen. So where do all these tactics and techniques come from? Well, as I mentioned before, a look at historical programs is highly instructive here. So let's look at COINTELPRO for a second. Known tactics included discrediting, smearing, character assassination, covert campaigns to destroy interpersonal relationships, harassment, conspicuous surveillance, also known as stalking, anonymous letters and phone calls, IRS tax audits, legal harassment, manipulation or strong-arming of parents, employers, school officials, co-workers, and others to create problems for targets, threats, intimidation, surreptitious home searches and black bag jobs, vandalism, and constant surveillance. Many features, of course, will sound familiar to targeted individuals. MKUltra features and goals included creating a subject who was easier to control and manipulate, creating programmed assassins, developing more effective means of torture and interrogation, breaking down the personality of the subject and inserting new belief systems, ethics, politics, personality traits, was performed largely on unwitting and unwilling subjects, was an attempt to manipulate mental states and alter brain function, including surreptitious drugging, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, various forms of torture, attempts to promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness in the subject so that they will be discredited in public. It was an attempt to produce amnesia for periods of time, and surreptitious production of confusion for extended periods of time. It was an attempt to alter the subject's personality to become dependent on his tormentors, an attempt to lower the subject's ambition and work efficiency, attempt to impair eyesight or hearing, attempts to activate specific behaviors by remote means. Again, many of these will sound familiar to targeted individuals. Stasi tactics, also known as Zersetzen torture, included such features as secret persecution, secret methods of control and manipulation, involving even the interpersonal relationships of the target, extensive use of unofficial collaborators, also known as regular people, use of the state's influence to turn public and private institutions against the target, was a psychological attack intended to deprive the target of the ability to mount a hostile political action, was known to often cause irreversible damage to targets, was an attempt to gain influence over the target in such a way that more undesirable attitudes and beliefs could be slowly replaced with more preferable traits and beliefs over time. It was an attempt to cause fragmentation, paralysis, disorganization, and isolation of the target. It was an attempt at political and ideological re-education of the target. It was used in situations when judicial proceedings are not convenient. Essentially, it's extrajudicial punishment. It involved attempts to frame or entrap targets, involved slander or character assassination, involving some true and some false but always degrading information, included orchestrating a series of social and professional failures in order to damage self-confidence, involved creation of doubts about the future, stimulation of mistrust or paranoia, exploitation of personality weaknesses, addictions, etc., overt and covert surveillance, intercepting mail, telephone calls, etc., tampering with property, vehicles, poisoning the food and medications, entering the residence and leaving traces of evidence in order to threaten or intimidate the target by adding, removing, or modifying objects. And again, many of these features will sound familiar to targeted individuals. So nearly all of these apply to the current program, or at least they appear to. More about that in a moment. Now add in the use of advanced neuroweaponry, and you have a very potent takedown program indeed. Okay, so at this point we have a pretty good understanding of the program. But we have one more thing that needs to be understood about this program, and that's the advanced weaponry that's being used. Here's the key point that researchers at this point have come to understand. These weapons are capable of being used on people and affecting their behavior with no trace being left. So what does this mean in practice? Well, imagine a target has been deliberately sensitized, for example, to coughing, mainly by a few well-placed agents or collaborators who are deliberately coughing near the target. Now fast forward a while and imagine the target's out at a restaurant eating dinner. He can't help but notice that at least 10 different people around him are constantly coughing and clearing their throats. And this seems to happen everywhere he goes. Every day. Day in and day out. And it's always different people participating. Now, Have thousands of people been contacted and told to deliberately cough whenever near the target? Or is something else happening? Well, researchers now believe something else is happening. Researchers now believe, in fact, that most of these people are being remotely influenced to cough, for example, with no idea that the urge to cough did not come from themselves. To quote a famous scientist, Jose Delgado, in his famous book, Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society, Physical Control of the Mind, individuals whose brain centers are electrically stimulated believe that their evoked actions are their own unique actions. Their conscious mind rationalizes the evoked actions away. People experiencing this electrical stimulation aren't consciously aware of an external influence. So, targets should reconsider the situation in which they find themselves. Many of their so-called harassers may have no idea that they are part of something at all, let alone that their actions are viewed as harassing toward a particular target. This should be kept in mind. Of course, the implications for humanity are frightening. Is it possible that we're heading towards a synthetic reality where people's thoughts, conversations, hopes, dreams, fears, illnesses, and major life events are controlled by supercomputers and handlers, all without their knowledge? Something to think about. Finally, what can and in fact must be done about the targeted individual program? Well, several things. First of all, targets must speak out, especially those who have their wits about them. Understand that this program is highly disruptive and is designed to make even the most solid citizen look as if they've become delusional. So, that brings up the next point, which is that if you know someone who this is happening to, don't count them as crazy. They very well may be a target of this program. Recognize that the issues they were speaking about before they got into their current situation are still just as valid now as they were before. In fact, it was probably the very legitimacy of what they were fighting about that led powerful forces to want to discredit them so thoroughly. Always remember that. Next, whistleblowers aware of this program must come forward. As we've seen with such revelations as mass NSA spying revealed by Edward Snowden and others, without whistleblowers, nothing's going to happen. Even with whistleblowers, maybe nothing will happen, but it's the best shot we've got. Next, fearless journalists must pursue this story. It was investigative journalists who brought widespread attention to MKUltra, COINTELPRO, and much of the unethical human experimentation that has occurred in America. Finally, targets must come together. That's why this covert harassment conference is great. It's definitely the right thing to do. There is strength in numbers. Never give up the fight. Thank you for your attention.